What truly begins to dismantle a narcissistic woman is not your anger, your explanations, or even your resistance. Those things still feed the dynamic. What destabilizes her at the deepest psychological level is your emotional detachment. Not coldness, not cruelty, but the quiet withdrawal of emotional investment. From a Jungian perspective, narcissism is sustained by projection. She projects power, desirability, and superiority onto herself, but those projections require an audience to exist. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop trying to be understood, the projection collapses back onto her. A narcissistic woman is highly attuned to emotional energy. Your frustration, your longing, even your pain confirms her psychological relevance. But when your emotional responses flatten into calm neutrality, something disturbing happens for her. The internal script breaks. She expects pursuit, defense, or collapse. Instead, she meets silence and emotional self-regulation. This is experienced not as indifference, but as loss of control. And for someone whose identity depends on control, that loss feels existential. Detachment does not mean suppressing emotion. It means reclaiming it. You are no longer outsourcing your emotional state to someone who thrives on managing it. Jung would describe this as the withdrawal of libido from a destructive complex. The energy that once animated the relationship returns to the self. And when that happens, the narcissistic dynamic starves. There is no drama to harvest, no chaos to organize, no emotional leverage to pull. What makes this unbearable for her is that detachment exposes a truth she cannot escape. She was never the sour canal. The moment of psychological rupture occurs when you begin to embody self-respect, not as a declaration, but as a lived reality. A narcissistic woman does not dominate through strength alone. She dominates through the gradual erosion of your boundaries. Over time, what you tolerate becomes the architecture of her power. Each compromise teaches her where your limits dissolve. But the moment you quietly restore those limits, something fundamental shifts. Self-respect is not confrontation. It does not announce itself or seek validation. It shows up in choices, what you no longer explain, what you no longer excuse, and what you calmly walk away from. From a Jungian lens, this is the reassertion of the ego's rightful boundary against an invasive complex. You are no longer organized around her moods, expectations, or reactions. Your behavior signals an internal realignment, one that removes her from the center of your psychological universe. This is deeply unsettling for a narcissistic woman because her authority was never intrinsic, it was borrowed. It existed only because you deferred to it. When you stop negotiating your dignity, her invisible throne collapses. She may respond with confusion, provocation, or sudden charm, but these are not signs of power. They are signs of loss. She is testing whether the old rules still apply. What truly breaks the illusion is consistency. One boundary can be challenged. A pattern of self-respect cannot. When your actions repeatedly confirm that access to you requires respect, she is forced to confront a reality she cannot control. The dynamic reverses. You are no longer reacting to her behavior, she is reacting to your standards. And this is the insight to carry forward. The moment you stop asking to be treated with respect and start living as if it is non-negotiable, you reclaim authority over your life. And anyone who depended on your self-betrayal to feel powerful will feel that loss immediately, of your worth, only the consumer of your attention. When that attention is gone, the illusion fades. And here is the reflection to sit with. The moment you stop reacting is the moment you begin reclaiming your psychological sovereignty. And no one can control a mind that no longer seeks permission to be free, one of the most misunderstood acts of strength in a narcissistic dynamic is silence. People often confuse silence with weakness, avoidance, or fear. In reality, silence is what removes the narcissistic woman's greatest defense mechanism, distraction. She survives by keeping the focus outward, on conflict, on chaos, on your reactions. When you stop explaining yourself, stop defending your intentions, and stop seeking closure, the noise disappears. And in that quiet, something she has spent her life avoiding begins to surface. From a Jungian perspective, narcissism is built around a fragile ego that cannot tolerate introspection. Self-reflection threatens to expose the shadow, the unresolved emptiness, shame, and insecurity buried beneath the constructed persona. Your silence removes the external mirror she manipulates. There is no argument to twist, no emotional energy to redirect. What remains is her own internal landscape, unfiltered and inescapable. This is why silence often provokes escalation. Sudden accusations, emotional bait, or exaggerated vulnerability are attempts to restore the familiar rhythm. These are not expressions of power, but efforts to avoid self-confrontation. When none of them work, the discomfort intensifies. She is forced, however briefly, to encounter herself without an audience. For you, silence is not about withholding communication. It is about withdrawing participation from a psychologically unsafe exchange. You are no longer feeding a system designed to consume your clarity. Jung would describe his as stepping out of a projection field. You refuse to carry what does not belong to you. And here is the reflection to hold on to. When you choose silence over explanation, you are not abandoning your voice. You are protecting it. Because the strongest statement you can make is not what you say, but what you no longer feel the need to explain. Perhaps nothing unsettles a narcissistic woman more than watching you grow beyond the version of yourself she once defined. Narcissistic dynamics depend on a carefully maintained narrative, one in which she is central, superior, and indispensable, while you are positioned as flawed, dependent, or incomplete without her. This story allows her to preserve a sense of dominance. But when you begin to heal, mature, and expand independently, that narrative begins to fracture. From a Jungian standpoint, this is the individuation process in motion. You are no longer organized around approval or survival within the relationship. Instead, you are integrating disowned parts of yourself, confidence, autonomy, discernment, that once threatened the dynamic. Your growth is not loud or performative. It is steady and embodied. And precisely because it is not aimed at her, it becomes impossible for her to dismiss or control. What makes this so destabilizing is that your progress invalidates the psychological role she assigned you. If you become more grounded, more self-aware, and more fulfilled without her presence, then the image she constructed of her, self as essential and you as deficient, can no longer hold. This creates a form of cognitive and emotional dissonance she struggles to resolve. She may attempt to rewrite history, minimize your progress, or suddenly reappear with charm or criticism. These are efforts to restore the old story. But growth has a quality that cannot be argued with. It is visible in how you carry yourself, how you respond rather than react, and how your life expands instead of contracts. Jung understood that once individuation begins, regression becomes increasingly difficult. You cannot unsee what you have integrated. So here is the reflection to carry forward. When you choose growth over validation, you quietly dismantle every false story that once kept you small. And the most powerful response to manipulation is becoming someone who no longer fits the role you were assigned. At a certain point in this process, something decisive happens. Your independence cuts off the narcissistic supply. A narcissistic woman does not relate for mutual connection, she relates for regulation. Attention, validation, emotional reliance, these are not side benefits, they are the fuel. As long as she remains the source of reassurance, approval, or emotional grounding, the dynamic survives. But when you become psychologically self-sufficient, the entire system destabilizes. Independence here is not isolation. It is the internal shift where you no longer look outward to stabilize your sense of self. From a Jungian perspective, this marks a critical movement of psychic energy. Libido that was once bound to the relationship is reclaimed and reinvested into your own life, your values, work, purpose, and inner development. You are no longer oriented around being seen, chosen, or validated. You become anchored. This is deeply intolerable to a narcissistic woman because it renders her unnecessary, not rejected, irrelevant. She may attempt to provoke emotion, offer intermittent warmth, or reassert importance through guilt, nostalgia, or crisis. These are attempts to restore dependency, but independence neutralizes them. You can witness the behavior without being pulled into it. There is nothing to hook into anymore. What often confuses people is that this loss of supply can trigger intense reactions. Sudden interest, exaggerated affection, or even hostility may surface. These are not signs of renewed connection. They are signs of withdrawal. The supply has been interrupted, and the psyche reacts accordingly. But if independence is maintained, the pattern cannot re-establish itself. Jung understood that true freedom emerges when the self no longer seeks completion through another. At that point, manipulation loses its leverage. So here is the reflection to leave with. The moment you stop needing someone to validate your existence, you step out of their control entirely, because no one can dominate a person who has learned how to stand emotionally on their own. In the end, what completes the sea? A lapse of the narcissistic dynamic is not your success, your detachment, or even your independence. It is your inner peace. Peace is deeply threatening to a narcissistic woman because it signals something she cannot penetrate or influence. Conflict gives her entry. Emotion gives her leverage. But peace closes the door entirely. It tells the nervous system that the threat is past, and to someone who depends on psychological turbulence to feel alive and relevant, that calm feels like erasure. From a Jungian perspective, inner peace is the outcome of integration. The shadow has been acknowledged, the projections withdrawn, and the self no longer needs to be defined through opposition or validation. You are not suppressing emotion, you are no longer ruled by it. This is why peace cannot be faked. It shows in your posture, your tone, your pacing, and most importantly, in your lack of urgency. There is nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing to chase. This is often the moment when a narcissistic woman realizes she has lost psychological access. She may sense it intuitively. Attempts to provoke emotion fall flat. Stories that once destabilized you no longer land. Even your absence feels different. Not dramatic, not resentful, just settled. And that is what makes it unbearable. She cannot compete with your wholeness because wholeness does not engage in power struggles. Jung believed that when the psyche reaches a state of inner alignment, it becomes self-regulating. External chaos loses its authority. At that point, manipulation has nowhere to attach itself. The relationship no longer defines you, and neither does the wound it left behind. So here is the final reflection. When you cultivate inner peace, you don't just walk away from the narcissistic dynamic. You rise above it, and in doing so, you reclaim the quiet, unshakable power of being fully at home within yourself.